This week we're looking at Psalm 139, and this is one of the great Psalms of all Scripture, one of the great passages in all Scripture, actually, dealing with the magnificence of God. We see the omnis presented here, the omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence. We've seen omniscience. God is all-knowing of all things. This time we're going to look at omnipresence. God is everywhere at once. At all places, you cannot hide from God. And as I tried to make the case yesterday, David so far is not necessarily pleased with this kind of a knowledge of God. God is always with him. God always knows what he's doing. God even knows his thoughts and motives. And that's kind of bothersome to David so far, it seems like to me. And if we go back to verse 7 now and start picking up on his omnipresence, it still seems like he's running from God. He even asks the question, where can I go from your spirit? That seems like it's something he wants to do. He wants to get away from the presence of God's Spirit. But where can I go to get away from that presence? Or where can I flee from your presence? You know, can I get away? So he marks out a few places where he could try to get away. He says, if I ascend to heaven, you are there. Well, obviously, heaven is the abode of God. The special place of his presence, I suppose we might say, although he's omnipresent, as this passage is showing us. But you can't go to heaven and get away from God. Well, how about Sheol? I will make my bed in Sheol. Behold, you are there. Sheol is the place of the dead, the place of the grave. And so I can go to the grave, I can die, and yet I still cannot get away from God. If I take the wings of dawn, and if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me. Now, I can now fly off to the remotest part of the universe or the globe, try to hide in the desert, try to hide wherever, still God is there. I cannot get away from God. And so it seems to me that up to this point, he's talking about fleeing from the presence of God. He just wants to be left alone to do his own thing. But something changes right here in the middle of verse 10. It seems like for whatever reason, there is a clicking in his mind. And I think you and I have experienced this, haven't we? There are times when maybe we're not so sure that we are appreciating all that God is and has done for us. We would just simply like to be left alone to do our thing, even though we know that's wrong, even though we know it's counterproductive. And then the Lord grabs our hearts, maybe through a sermon, maybe through a scripture passage, maybe through a song. In some way or the other, the Lord catches our attention and we realize we're making foolish choices. And rather than running from God, as David seems to be doing so far, he now turns to God and he begins to truly appreciate him more and more. And so we see that in verse 10, even there your hand will lead me. Look at the indications of the change. The word hand here is a different word. It's a word that speaks about the whole hand and the forearm, which indicates power. He's starting to see the value of the power of God here. And maybe that's because of where he is. Look at verse 11. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even in the darkness is not dark to you. And the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. He sees maybe a location, a place, a time, a situation where he truly needs the God's presence. You know, when things are tripping along quite well and there's no issues, maybe we can do our own thing. But in the darkness, in a place of difficulty, he sees the need for the hand of God, the power of God, the strength of God, the presence of God. And so he says, in that time, I begin to see the need for you to lead me. That's another word we see here. He sees that God lays hold of him. He guides him. This is a very word found in Psalm 23 that speaks of God guiding us as a shepherd. In verses 11 and 12, as we've just read, he finds comfort in the presence of God at the hardest of times. And so it may be a situation that we're not privy of here. Perhaps as David is kind of, being kind of wanting to flee from God, get away from God a little bit, be left alone, God takes him to a dark place. God takes him to a place where he needs the Lord. And now he turns to him. Remember in Psalm 119, he says, it was good that I was afflicted, because then I turned to the Lord and to his word. Sometimes the Lord has to take us in those valleys to get our attention, to show us the wonderfulness of himself in our lives. And maybe that's what happened to David. In those dark places, he saw how wonderful God was, and now he begins to appreciate who God really is. And so that brings us to verse 13 tomorrow, that we'll look at, as David now not only is accepting the presence of God, he is warming up in a big way to what God is like in his life. So we'll look at verse 13 tomorrow.